Welcome everyone, thank you for being here today. Je m'appelle Antoine Chisdivalé, je suis coordinateur aux tables rondes et aux ateliers pour la Société historique du Canada avec mon collègue Dave Hazen. Bienvenue à cet atelier qui s'intitule La conception de projets de recherche en partenariat d'envergure en histoire, ou en anglais, Designing Large-Scale Partnerships Research Projects in History. This is our last workshop of our 2022-2023 series, and it's nice to see some faces that we have seen before, so thank you very much for being here. I will start by doing a land acknowledgement. I am myself situated on the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka, a place in Montreal, a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among many First Nations, including the Kanien'kehá:ka of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, Huron-Wendat, Abenaki, and Anishinaabeg. We recognize and respect the Kanien'kehá:ka as the traditional custodians of the lands and waters on which we meet today. Je vais aussi la faire en français dans l'optique du bilinguisme. Je me trouve sur le territoire traditionnel des Kanien'kehá:ka, qui sert depuis longtemps de lieu de rencontre et d'échange entre de nombreuses Premières Nations, notamment les Kanien'kehá:ka de la Confédération Haudenosaunee, les Huron-Wendat, les Abenaki et les Anishinaabeg. Nous reconnaissons et respectons les Kanien'kehá:ka en tant que gardiens traditionnels des terres et des eaux sur lesquelles nous nous rencontrons aujourd'hui. I would invite you all as well, since we are not all meeting from the same place, to think about Indigenous land on which you find yourself today, and to reflect on the past and its legacy on the present here today. So our presenter today for our meeting is Stephen High, who is the president of the CHA. Stephen High has extensive experience leading SSHRC-funded partnership projects. He led the award-winning Montreal Life Stories project from 2006 to 2012, which was funded by SSHRC's Community Research Alliance program, which worked with Montrealers displaced by mass violence in other parts of the world. He is currently heading the transnational Deindustrialization and the Politics of Our Time partnership projects, on which you can learn more on the website deindustrialization.org. So without further ado, I will leave the floor to Stephen High. So Stephen, the floor is yours.
Merci bien, Antoine. C'est vraiment un plaisir d'être ici, parmi vous. So my approach to workshops is more informal. So it's not going to be like a really formal presentation leading to a question and answer. I've got different things that we need to talk about, I think, in terms of the issue of large-scale partnership projects. And so I guess maybe I thought I'd start by saying, well, why this workshop? Why did I think that this workshop would be of value to the Canadian Historical Association, and to our community? I think one of the reasons, that sort of one of the things I've noticed over the years is that, there's a very clear idea of what a historian does, right? In terms of the historian's imaginary, right? It's a single researcher in an archive, that does research for a long time, right? So it's an example of slow research, right? You're spending that time, you're in conversation with history through, often through documents. And this is sort of very, I think very strong in terms of the historian's imaginary. And then it results in, journal articles and books and so on. Yet I think, also, I think when we look sort of wider to university-based research, we're seeing a lot of changes going on. You're seeing a shift towards, collaborative research, project-based research, research that goes public in all kinds of ways, right? That still has an important, academic, output, right? Through books, peer-reviewed books and peer-reviewed articles, but also has, a wide range of outputs that speak to wider relationships, right? To, the communities that we study, and so on. And again, this ties into, I think, efforts to sort of, rethink extractive approaches to research, right? And raising questions like, who's this research for? By whom, from whom, for whom, these kinds of things. And so like funding agencies like SSHRC have shifted, I think, in a big way. Have probably led the way, right? Putting a lot of money into what they call the partnership stream, right? So researching in partnership, often with the communities that, whose histories, these are. And I've led two of these large, projects that Antoine mentioned, right? The first one from 2006 to 12, which was a CURA grant, Community University Research Alliance. And it's a beautiful program because it was again, premised on the idea that, again, communities should be partners in research, right? That you learn with communities, not just about them. And that's a, to me, a political shift in how we think about research. And that project, worked with survivor communities, Cambodian, Rwandan, Haitian, European Jewish communities, and others, to record stories. We recorded 500 interviews, but then we worked with those stories to open up spaces for education, for political action, for exchange, through like theater performances, museum exhibitions, even 500 metro cars in Montreal had audio portraits where you can hear stories and so on. So the partnerships allowed us, to go public in ways that, I don't have the skill set to do myself, right? So through collaboration, you can actually do, a variety of things, a spectrum of things. And then the project I'm working on now, and so that older project was very much grassroots. Most of the partners didn't have staff, right? These were community-based groups. The new project I'm on is thinking about sort of the rise of right-wing populism in relation to economic crisis. So we see that with Trump and Brexit and so on. And so there, it's a bit more of a maybe more traditional research in the sense that the partnerships are mainly with research centers, industrial museums, trade unions. And so it's a bit, they do have data, they do have staff, right? So it's a different, it's a different mix. So there's no one way, I think, to do partnerships. So I thought this would be a good opportunity for us to sort of think about, historical research in partnership, some of the things to think about in relation to that. This is not going to be like a mechanical grants workshop where where what you would get from like maybe your research office at your university. It's more of a space to sort of reflect on sort of the pros and cons of project-based research. Some of the things to think about when designing and envisioning a large scale project. There'll be some tips in terms of like SSHRC and some of the things to think about. I served also on a SSHRC's adjudication committees for many years for partnerships, as well as the midterm review board. So I've seen hundreds of applications, I guess, over the years. So I come with some some experience on these things. Well, one of the things I've noticed in being on adjudication boards is that historians are underrepresented in a big way from these large partnership grants. That in some ways, it's foreign to us, right? A little bit like we don't in our training of the students, grad students, right? We don't even think about how do you do research and collaboration. We don't train for it. So in a way, it's a stretch, right, for a lot of people, a lot of historians, and it's certainly something I didn't, I was never trained on, right, and so in the end, you're training yourself, right? You're an autodidact, right? Like you're having to figure it out, while you do it. I think one of like some of the positives about large scale projects is that first of all, like it's the one category of grant from SSHRC, for example, where community organizations can actually be formally part of the project, right? Can be co-directing the project, can be, co-initiating the project. And so it is a category of grant that allows for, these kinds of relationships, right? To open up the research process beyond just, the historian or, a group of interdisciplinary scholars, for example, to allow a wider spectrum of voices and experiences into a research process, right? And so if you are thinking about doing research differently, or if you're thinking about again collaboration allowing us to bring different skill sets together, right, that aren't in any one person it's potentially a really great thing. Another advantage, I think, is time. I think, one of the challenges, like for professors, certainly, is that we don't have a lot of time, or we're stretched, right? We're constantly juggling things. And a lot of the grants that are out there are relatively short term. And if you are interested in sort of building relationships, or if you're interested in sort of a longer arc, right, to the research, the research that you're doing, the main partnership, program, which so the partnership has three steps. There's Engage, which is a small grant of 25,000 that allows you to work with like a single partner on a short-term project. And then there's Development, which is $200,000, which allows you, over 3 or 4 years to work, perhaps with a smaller group, to do a project. And then the big partnerships, which there's 2.5 million, which can be as long as 7 years, right? What I love about that is that you're spending a lot less time grant writing, right? You can actually, and the actual success rate is similar, right? So if you apply for like a insight grant, a normal one, say $80,000 for a single researcher, or if you apply for a $2.5 million grant, the percentage, the success rate is very similar, right? And so, you can actually invest, in building something, and then not have to apply for grants for, a number of years. And that gives you, in a way, you can, it helps consolidate yourself a little bit, right? You can really, again, working with, these relationships and so on. So I think this, this is a positive thing in my mind. It allows us to go public, right, in ways that might be hard otherwise. And so there's a lot of emphasis on what they call knowledge mobilization, which is essentially going outward, right? So either into academic sort of production, right, books, articles, and so on, but also, there's emphasis there on sort of public education, or public results, right? The learning isn't just, restricted to, to academic or disciplinary sort of norms. It can be generative, right? So it allows, because it's a longer term, and because it's there's resources, it allows time to evolve, right? And so it allows time for, it to be generative, right? For new things to sort of emerge during that 7 years, which I've also really appreciated, in terms of the work that I did, or I do. That it's not just locked in, it's not like a science experiment where, you have a very precise question and then you just do that, and then, never that way, right? But it allows for more flex. Another positive, I'm going through some positives and I'll go through negatives, right? And I think, Ben's negative was a big one. Funding for students, right? Like when you apply for, a partnership grant, they want to see, really like a majority of the funds going to students, right? So it allows you to fund students, right, in a big way. So like my current project, I think it's 65% of our budget is going directly to students, right? And that can take different forms. It could be fellowships where you're recruiting students to do a master's on a theme. Then you have a cluster of students who then are, you're creating like a, a pod of people, and then not just necessarily in one place, right? Like in our project, we have pods of different, different schools, not just in Canada, but around the world, that are being funded by SSHRC, right? So SSHRC money is going outward, and that's possible, right? Although there's an expectation that there's money coming back, right? And we'll talk about that when we get to money. So student support, right? So when we talk about like, the poverty level of graduate students and the insecurity of graduate students, I think this is helpful, although it shouldn't be on our shoulders, right, to, provide for our students, but it is a way to, to make a difference, and to channels, or match make students with like, opportunities. They're, postdocs, right? So you can obviously have, full postdocs attached to a partnership grant, which, And so 50,000 a year. And so if you have a 7-year project, it might be 2.5 million, but it's really 200,000 a year. That's a big chunk of your budget. Another way to go is to do top ups, right? So to try to like recruit, people to apply for like a SSHRC postdoc or an FRQSC postdoc or CHR postdoc or whatever. So they're getting external money, but then because they're working with a team member, you can give them a research stipend on top, right? That encourages people to apply, connect with the team, but in a way, it's cheaper for the project, right? So you're building, you're in a way it's like community building, right? You're bringing people in, you're connecting to people, and so on. And so to me, these are real pluses, right? That the conversation is wider, right? It's longer lasting, it's funded, so it's supported. You have students and so on. But there's real dangers, right? There's real problems, I think, also with project-based research, right? Like the first is, I think, parallel play. Like there's a lot of projects where everyone's doing their own thing, and so it's only a collective project in name only, where yeah, or we're coming together in more like administrative or bureaucratic kinds of ways, right? So you're having to report, all the time, and there's a lot of like administrative stuff, right? And I think that just deadens, right? Like I think you have to, when you're designing a project, you have to design a project that allows for like small groups of people to work together, right? And I think that counters the issue that Ben was mentioning in terms of it all just falling on one person. So you have these constituent parts that are funded, and so in a way funding like the research axes or the I use working groups as a model, and so those are funded, and then you have leaders, those working groups. So that way it's not just individualized, the money, right? So the budget is actually activating collaboration, right? So project design and budget, to me are very political, right? And that design, I think, helps, leads to, certain kinds of results. So the parallel play, like, so if you have a project that has, say like our Montreal Life Stories, we had 7 working groups. We had 4 that were embedded in 4 different cultural communities. So we had a Rwandan working group, a Cambodian working group, a Haitian working group, which were in a way, like they're always co-led community university, but in a way those were more community driven. And then you had 3 other ones that were more transversal, right? So education, oral history performance. And so those were a bit more academic because they weren't so much tied to or embedded in the community. And so each of those 7 working groups, had their funds and were doing things. But how do you ensure that you don't have like 7 different projects in the end of the day, right? That don't talk to each other. So you constantly need to think about like how do you come together and move forward, right? How do you create mechanisms so that there is like a project-wide horizon, so that people are in conversation with each other beyond the small pods. And you got to break it down, right? If you have even 10 people, you have to sort of break it down in order to make it manageable. And these were large projects, right? Like the Montreal Life Stories started with 40 and we ended up with 300. And then Depot started with 28 and we're already at 100, right? Including all the student affiliates and postdocs and so on. So parallel play, so that comes back to design, right? Making sure that, and I'll come back to like some of the strategies around that. That's a big problem. Another problem is like hierarchy, right? That there's a danger in large scale projects. I think it's also true in smaller projects where students are doing the work, right? They're out doing the field work, they're doing the interviews, and the profs then benefit and they get the publications and so on. And so you need to find ways that's where in my mind that you sort of challenge that sort of trickle down theory of academia. And so so thinking about collaboration and models of collaboration that allows for, again, you know, co-leadership, right? I think is very, very important. And having ways for students to be sort of in the fold that's not just as research assistants. So like in large scale projects, students would be there as student affiliates because they have their own thesis, they have their own projects, right? Which may be fully funded or not, depending. So they're there because they are researchers doing their own work and they're part of that conversation. You have student research assistants, you have interns, you have, I guess those would be the categories, right? And making sure those students have a voice, right? So a student caucus, having a student rep on decision-making bodies, right? So that they are, there's ways, there's mechanisms to ensure that, the students are heard and that they are invested, right, in a large scale project, right? So hierarchy, parallel play, and I think the third one is exactly what Ben said, right? That, that it's not really in partnership. You have a long list of names, a long list of partners, right, that are officially part of a project, but it's really, driven by one person. And so sometimes you see that in grant applications where, you know, all the, you know, all the funding for, say, student fellowships is only going to one university, even though there's like 7 universities part of a team. That tells you something, right? That tells you that it's very centralized, that, there's a danger maybe of empire building, within a project. Um, I think there's also the issue of like rigidity versus looseness. Like you want to, it's sort of like Goldilocks that if it's too rigid, then you lose sort of you know, the spontaneity, the emergence, right, of the research, right, and how, a collective project can be a space where ideas are constantly being sort of are constantly sort of emerging out of conversation, right? And so you need to have direction, right? But you need to have flexibility, right? So how do you build that into your design? How do you build that into your budget, right? And I'll come back to that. So broad brushstrokes, I think these are some of the issues. And I think the other one, I guess, would be just administrative load. Um, um, a big project is heavy for the PI, and so you need to make sure that it's well resourced, right? That you do have like staff that allow like some of that day-to-day administration, right? All those forms and so on that you have, so that's not on your shoulders, right? None of us become a professor in order to become like a manager. I don't think. And so resourcing the center is really important too, right? Just allows you as the PI to be engaged in that creative stuff, right? Which is why I think you do collaboration, and why this would be important. And so that means staffing, but I think it also means convincing your university or your institution to give you the time, right? Because it is about time and money. And so at Concordia, they have a policy that if you get a partnership grant, your teaching load's cut in half. So it's the same for everyone. And that was a factor, right, in my decision, not because not because I don't like teaching, I love teaching, but just meant that it allowed me to have a different mix of my responsibilities, right? Because it is time consuming. And you need, to be a PI, there's a lot of care that's involved in that, right? You have to, there's a lot of facilitation. And so that, having the time, right, is really, really vital, I think, to success. So the first stage is key. Like projects, the design stage is in a way everything. like if you are a PI, you develop a project idea, and then you invite people to join. You're inviting people to join your project, right? So I think that initial stage of envisioning a project, if it is collaborative, if it's truly in partnership, that it needs to be done collaboratively, right? Because once you start having structures in place, right, choices being made in terms of the key questions, in terms of the frame of the project, these are big things, right? And yes, you make adjustments later, but it's adjustments onto onto a structure. And so you need to spend time, right, envisioning together. So with the Montreal Life Stories, we spent 8 months, right? So that was a project that came from nowhere in a way. And so it was about like a snowball sort of slowly going down a hill. And so we had a monthly meeting, and we grew, and through networks and so on. And then we decided, okay, well, like if you're going to have a working group within the project, there has to be both community and university at the table. And so we had some people who were like researchers doing, Latin American refugees, but there were no community people. So that meant there was no working group on that. And so we had some rules in terms of what needed to happen in order for, people to be sort of a constituent part of the project. And so it grew organically, right, over that 8 months. And because some people were interested in like, what happened over there in terms of, the mass violence versus other people who are interested in what, forced migration, integration. And so the life story was a methodology that developed because it was a way to synthesize experience, right? And to think and to center people, right? And so that came out of the conversation. It wasn't where we started. Whereas the new project, the Depot project, it was organic, but it was in a way, pre-organic in the sense that these were relationships that were built over many years, small relationships, so student exchanges, joint publication here or this or that. And so it was a way to consolidate all that and to create a process, a way to ramp up or to, an existing sort of web of relationships, right? And so either one I think is really good because it's real, right? Sometimes you get applications that are very quick, right? That are very single person centered. And I think that comes across often in the grant application, right? So you need to take time at the beginning to really, really build those relationships, really, get it so everyone is part of the design, right? That way it's ownership, right? It's co-ownership, it's co-creation. It's not just joining someone else's project. One thing I've learned is that it's really important that that the people that come together, that it's really like central to what they want to do. So again, as academics, we're often stretched, right? We're being invited to go over there or invited to go over there, and sometimes that it takes away from where you really want to be, right? And so I think the key is to find a group of people who really want to be here, right? Really want to be in this process because that's where they are anyways, right? So it's funding, core interests, I guess, right? And that way the people are going to be more present. They're not being taken away from what they really want to do. That allows people to apply for other grants, right? So then you have overlapping grants. So you get, other people maybe getting an individual insight grant that sort of connects like an interlocking brick. And so the partnership grant becomes like a spine, right? Like becomes like a core, and then people are connecting to it in their own way. And I think that's successful because yeah, like it ties to core interests, right? And you have fewer sort of names on sheets who don't show up to anything, who are not present because they're doing something else. And so obviously the PI has to be present in a big way, right, in order to facilitate that, right, in order to guide that, right, but not dominate it, as Ben was saying. I think another thing that to think about is with SSHRC committees. So with partnership, it's not, it's an interdisciplinary adjudication. So if you apply for like an insight grant, smaller insight, chances are you're going to have other historians assessing. You go to the historians committee, historians are assessing you. So, the historical discipline frames the adjudication, the judgment. With partnership, the adjudication is interdisciplinary, but it also spans community. So you have community representatives there. Now, community can mean a lot of things. It could be like an Indigenous organization, or it could be like the Bank of Nova Scotia, right? You don't know, right? And so it depends a bit, right? And so, but almost everyone, or basically everyone on those committees, has been involved, usually as a PI or co-PI, principal investigator, in a big project, right? So they know about projects. They know about, that the project has to be sort of big but not too big, ambitious but not too ambitious, in the sense that it has to be doable, it has to be real, right? So they're looking at design. They're looking at, are these partnerships real, or are they just paper? Is it fake? So that's why I say that you really want to spend time, right, in designing your project. And because they're not historians, or might only be one or two historians on the adjudication board, the idea matters. Like the so what question is really important, right? That you need to sort of convince them that your research is important, that your research is urgent, that it matters. And this can be hard, I think, sometimes for historians, because we know it's important, but how do we communicate and convince that to people who are very, present day focused? And I don't ever use the word presentist, but people who might not, naturally think, maybe the Middle Ages are important, right? So how do you translate that? I think is very, very important when you apply for partnership grants. And I think having those community partners is one way to do that, because they're seeing the importance, right? And so that helps you, I think, bridge that gap. The size, I think, matters in the sense that, like sometimes people will scale up their project more than they should, maybe bigger than the research question deserves, or maybe bigger than the project design can handle. And sometimes, because there's that 2.5 million maximum, everyone, people think, oh, we got to apply for the full 2.5 million, or else we're somehow losing money. But sometimes when you apply for like 1.7 million or something, it stands out, right? People say, okay, you've made a choice here, right? I'm not saying that you have to scale down your ideas, right? You can go for the full amount, but don't feel that you have to go for the full amount. What you want is an alignment with your design and with your questions, right? And the budget has to be real, right? It has to seem like it's not just padded, right? People are looking at the budgets, quite critically. I also think it's important to have individual researchers, like co-applicants, right? Co-researchers. And then you have a category called collaborators. Then you have a category called partners. I think it's really important that every partner, right, every partner organization has an individual, right, either as a collaborator or as a co-applicant. Because at the end of the day, it's about people, right? And if you have a partner there's no individual researcher or individual sort of who's going to be present, then there's a danger that partnership is really, underdeveloped, right? And so I think it's good practice, right, whenever possible, to align the individuals with the partnerships. Now, I have to admit, my current project, we have several partners that don't have an individual, and I regret that personally now, because those are, of course, the partners that aren't very involved, right? In a way, those partnerships were underdeveloped, right? And that's why we didn't have those individuals, in that list. And so I think that's something to think about. Also, the bigger the project is, like 2.5 million sounds like a lot of money, and it is. But if you have 50 people over 7 years, it becomes less money than you think, right? Especially if you have like a staffer who has to do all the admin. So bigger isn't always better, right? And so it depends on your project, depends on what you're trying to do. And so I think that should determine, the size, right? And don't let money sort of, you know, you don't want money to be in search of an idea, right? You want your ideas to drive, how much you're asking for. Um, and you can't do everything, right? That there's like, you can't do everything. So Montreal Life Stories, there are all kinds of communities we didn't look at, right? Because those communities weren't around the table, or the issue around like how about genocide in terms of Indigenous genocide here, and so and we thought about that, and we thought, do we go there, right? But how does that get, it's already really, really big. How do you handle that? And so we developed partnerships like outside our project, like project to project sort of relationships with, other organizations like Legacy of Hope. So we realized that in the end, there's always a frame, right? And so you have to make decisions and think about that. Or my current project, we're looking at 6 countries. Well, it could be 24 countries, right? And so I think there should be reasons about who's in the frame, right? Who the partners are. There should be a role. There should be a reason why they're part of the project. They all have to write letters of support, and those should be real. They shouldn't just be sort of um, you know um, cookie cutter kind of answers, right? They should be talking about why that research is important for them, right? And what they're contributing to the whole. Um, the the growth of the project, right? So thinking like, say you get the grant, right, and you have a team. Um, do you grow over the course of the 7 years? Like, do you want to snowball, get bigger? Getting bigger gets heavier, but that also allows you to make connections, right? And so you can have like mechanisms, pathways in. So, for example, our current project, you can apply to become an affiliated researcher or an affiliated student, right? And there's a process for that. And so that's allowed us to make wider connections to other, like, Global South or China. Um, but again, these things have to be sort of thought about and decided in advance. Um, Now, in terms of like governance, right? So you have a project. So how are decisions being made? And this is an important sort of piece of the application, an important piece of your design work. Um, and so I think most projects would have like a coordinating committee or an executive, and some would have a very small one. I tend to have one that might have like 8 people if it's a bigger project. And so like Montreal Life Stories, we had like a parity rule. So like it had to be half community, half university. So half of those 8, 4 of those 8 people were community-based partners, right? So, PAVS Rwanda, representing Rwandan genocide survivors, had a representative on there, and so on. Then you had the researchers, and that made sure that, that sort of the decisions being made by the project, were not just, driven by an individual or driven by, the researchers only, right? Or a group of researchers. And there's other ways of doing that, right? Or making sure that, on that coordinating committee, if you have research axes, that they're all represented, right? So in a way so if you have, say, 3 research axes that each have co-leaders, those 6 people should be really on the coordinating committee. And that way the coordinating committee can coordinate, right? Can actually, have a project-wide perspective. There's ways to ensure evening the playing field. So if you are inviting community members to become co-leaders, like how is that possible, right? So if they are part of organizations, that time can be, SSHRC allows, buying up of time, right? For, like part of the salary that could be taken by the grant. That's one way of doing it. Another way is to provide like honoraria or community release. So like Montreal Life Stories, we had so much money for like teaching release. We used the same amount of money for community release, right? That gave money to community members who are taking on sort of leadership roles, administrative roles, that recognize them in the same way, right? That professors are being recognized. And so design is, there's a lot involved, right? In trying to make sure, that the project reflects, your values, your goals, and so on. Language is another issue. Both my projects have been multi-language projects. So everything is in French and English because, it's Montreal. But in the Montreal Life Stories project, we had a working group, the Rwandan working group, which functioned in Kinyarwanda and French, and then the Cambodian working group, which were primarily in Khmer. And so that allowed spaces for different languages to sort of coexist, right? And in our new project, it's 6 countries, but it's 4 languages. And so again, French and English on everything, but we have Italian and German, in certain things, right? So websites, some other things, but not everything because it's too expensive, right? And so thinking about language, right, and bridging, I think is really important design. And then timeline. So 7 years, that's a long time. And so how do you think about that arc? And so again, I often say, like, you want to come together, you want to move forward, right? It's this sort of action that you're trying to do. And so you need sort of these moments over those 7 years where you mobilize, right? So it might be a conference, or might be like a publication, something that brings people together, right? And that allows you to sort of move forward. You get a sense of progression, right, over that 7-year arc. And at the end of the 7 years, you need some sort of ball at the end in order to culminate, right? So you're moving towards that. And so Montreal Life Stories, we had a series of international conferences, that were sort of regular, that allowed us to mobilize the project, but also allowed other projects to come and be in conversation with us. And so that was great. And that led to publications. And then at the end, we had like a month-long public programming where we had 57 events all over the city of Montreal, and we had a public presence. And so there was like a big ending. With the Depot project, we have, again, a commitment to sort of build relationships. So we have an annual summer institute for students. So we have 40 graduate students who come together. And so we're trying to forge like a next generation within this field who are working in their local or national context, but have a transnational sort of perspective. And we're trying to mentor that next generation. And so that's part of what we're doing. And at the end, we're having a transnational exhibition, right? Where all these different, museums and so on are going to have installations, and we're going to tie them in like simultaneously, and then have a tie-in so that they see that they're not alone, right? That, these processes are transnational and so on. So it doesn't have to be that kind of big scale, right? But I think just thinking about that 7 years and how you build in progression, right? Phases, right? What have you. SSHRC sort of requires, some reporting, right? So there's after the first year, you have to submit what's called a milestone report, which is a forward-looking report, which sets your goals, which in a way creates metrics, right? So that you are then judged against. And so you should be very careful, in making sure that those metrics are doable, like ambitious but doable. Because if you set that metrics and then 2 years or 3 years later we have the midterm review, so you get there's another adjudication where they're assessing what have you done so far, and do you deserve the last 3 years of funding? And so there's that accountability part. And the milestones very, very important to that. And so this is really, so it's about, how do you design a space, right? A process, with multiple outcomes. Ethics is another issue. If you're working with partners, there's sort of the ethics of just working collaboratively. There's also, I guess, tri-council ethics in terms of working with personal story. And I'm a firm believer that ethics isn't just a bureaucratic exercise. It's actually, it's like an ethos, right? And so you should be thinking about the ethics or the politics of what you're doing, throughout the process and throughout the design. And so for us, like on genocide, okay, that's a big ethics issue, right? So we spent a year developing our ethics module. We had to think through, what does consent mean? There's the interview, but there's also these other spaces, whether it's like performance or, we had a radio program. How does consent or harm, right? How does it translate into these other kinds of spaces that we are creating, where our research is occurring? Um, um, Withdrawal, what does that mean, right? And so we had to sort of think through that process, which was and think through together in that process, which is a way for the project to come together in a way, methodologically and ethically, right? And so to me, that was a really important part of forging, a shared language, a shared methodology, a shared ethos, right, for that project. And so it wasn't just an add-on bureaucratic thing; it was actually foundational, right? So I think there's those kinds of possibilities. Another challenge, I think, is when you deal with like multiple institutions. So, if you have researchers at multiple institutions, you have to go through ethics in each one. It's not so bad within Canada because they'll often, like, you go through like your main school, the host institution, and then once you have that, then you go to the other ones, and there might be little tweaks, but generally they accept that because it's all under tri-council. But if it's, if you're doing transnational work, there's loads of countries that don't have any ethics review, right? And we're dealing with that, or have very different ethics standards. And so how do you reconcile, different ethics regimes, right, within the same project? Or if you're working in Indigenous context, there's outgoing review in the sense of researchers, but there's also incoming review in terms of Indigenous communities, right? So making sure that there's a reconciliation in a sense of like just the ethics frame for the projects. That way, it's a shared thing, not something that divides us or that makes collaboration harder, right? Which I think I've seen happen in some projects. And then once you have an ethics sort of regime, right, ethics frame for your project, then training, so when people are coming in as RA, research assistants, or whoever, it's about orienting them to that ethos, that design, that methodology, right? And so that becomes a way to an important thing, I think, to make sure that people are more or less on the same page. Leveraging funds is another thing. So you apply for like a $2.5 million grant, but you're expected to have, $1.5 million or 2 million other funds, right? Although a lot of that can be in kind, and so in kind ranges from like space to volunteer time from community groups, to obviously cash contributions from groups. It's a wide range of, and it's monetarized essentially. And so you want to leverage the home institution. So if you are at University of Victoria, if they're going to host a partnership grant, they need to come up with real money, right? Often for like student fellowships or for course release for the principal investigator, but that they need to be at the table, right? And if they're not kind of come to the table, then you have to really question whether you can go forward because you need that support. And then there's also leveraging other places. So, for example, in the new project, we told all the different universities, we created this thing called like a PhD fellowship, which gives a PhD student $60,000, but it's matching funds, right? 30,000 from the institution and 30,000 from SSHRC. So if you can convince your institution to come up with the 30,000, then you too can have a PhD fellowship, right? A paid one. And that gave leverage to our individuals, right, at these other schools to sort of approach their university and say, hey, we can get some additional money for our students here. And so we were able to create these fellowships, throughout our network, right? And so having these kinds of, strategies, or it could be the same with a postdoc, right? Anyone who wants to create a postdoc, we'll have matching funds or whatever. And that allows you to leverage, other places in order to then, and that's good for SSHRC because SSHRC doesn't want, just SSHRC money going out. They want to see, synergy. They want to see people coming in. And of course, not everyone has money. And that's fine, right? They don't expect that from, like grassroots community groups, right? So you just talk about, the other ways that there's contributions. Yeah, and so like data sharing is important. Like there's a new data sharing sort of policy with SSHRC, right? They want to see, and also just open access, right? And so having like some money set aside in your budget for like publication subsidies, right? Whether it's allowing, certain articles and X number of articles being, open access, right? So it's not just behind a paywall, or it's a subsidy to a university publisher, for example, so you're not dependent on ASPP, or maybe it allows you to buy a bunch of copies that then you're able to give to community partners and others or your network, right? So using again the funds to make sure that learning, right, or that academic sort of scholarship, right, is shared. It's not just held back, or you need to have that university database license in order to access. Brand identity, like one of the fights I had at Concordia was they wanted to brand our project. So I think the standard Concordia blah blah, which is so institutional, and that would totally, and we were trying to create our own identity, which was bridging community university. And so having like the Concordia frame was just unacceptable, right? Like yes, it's based at Concordia, but it's a multi-institution, it's a collaborative grant. And so we had to fight back and say, no, like I'm sorry, but we have our own identity. And to do this would be to divide us, right? And I know other projects have been involved and have had similar debates with their branding police. And so that is a negotiation. So I think a PI has to, protect the integrity of their project, right, with their institution, and be a champion, because of course you got all the bureaucracy and so on. But it's worth it, right? I think it's worth it. And I think at the end, right, like, so you get, so say 7 years, and so you get X amount per year, that's also what you're proposing is, this much, this much, this much. So planning your budgets. But you don't want to go over budget, right? So building a little bit of buffer, because at the end of the day, you're responsible. And I know with the first project, we were so like, we were under budget every year until the end. And then we went over budget, right? And luckily at that time I had a research chair, and so I was able to use that money. If I didn't, it would have been a problem, right? And so, and because university finance systems are often clunky and not always capturing where the money's at, like I think you want to be careful at the end to make sure that that there's no last minute issue, right? And so I think being open as a
Mhm.
PI is very important. You don't go in with like a, you have it, you know what you want to cover, you know some of the key questions, but that conversation can go all kinds of different directions, right? And that's a good thing, right? And so to me, then in a way, a project is sort of similar, right? That yes, you have a purpose, you have a goal, you have some research questions, but it should be alive as a process, right? And 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 in conversation, everyone's learning, and so of course, what you end up with isn't necessarily the same thing as you planned, right? And probably shouldn't be, right? I think again, one of the values of like a 7-year long project is it allows you to have the time, right? It does take time to ramp up, right? So I often say like the first year of a collaborative grant, you're just trying to figure out, like you're doing you're setting foundations essentially, right? You're having those foundational conversations. You're talking through ethics. Maybe you're hiring someone, or maybe you're developing the fellowships. But you're doing all that foundational work that allows you to then, allows you to move forward in a sort of ethical way and so on. And so it's important not to rush, right? And the problem with the short-term grants is that you're forced to rush, right? So I use Basecamp. I've been using Basecamp since 2006. Now Basecamp is a cloud computing service, and how I use it is that everyone's in there, and everything's transparent, right? So that way there's no, except for the part on like personnel issues, right? So that way, even if you're not on the coordinating committee, you can see what the coordinating committee is doing. So all the minutes are there and so on, or if you're having different research axes. And so to me, that having an online space is a way to like manage, but also to ensure transparency. So I think that would be one suggestion I'd have. Like a lot of people use Basecamp. We also use SharePoint in terms of like research commons. So like a shared archive of materials that are being collected or thought about. That's another option, right? So you have a shared research space, right? So that way things are accessible. You don't have to be there physically. And obviously there's issues there around ethics. But those will be my two suggestions. Again, if you're looking at a collaborative project, you want to create collaborative virtual spaces, right? And you want to have spaces where people can work together at multiple scale. You can also create like shared bibliographies and what have you. So I think it's important, right? Having the management tools are really, it's a crucial thing. I guess maybe one of the last things I'd say is that SSHRC likes to see again progression. So if you are thinking about, if you're starting off doing like collaborative work, like start off with a small grant, right? Like the Engage, right, with one institution, small short-term project, and then build upwards and outwards from there, right? You don't have you don't need to sort of apply for the biggest thing possible right away, right? So that way it's then it's organic, right? Like it's building towards something bigger. But not enough historians apply for these large grants. So right now they tend to go to other disciplines, and I think that's a shame, because I think we need all all the support we can get, and this is certainly a way to support the kinds of work that we're doing.
Merci à tous et à toutes d'être venus aujourd'hui. Merci aussi, c'était notre dernier atelier, malheureusement, de notre série 2022-2023. It was our last workshop of our 2022-2023 series. So thank you to everyone who came and listened to that. Thank you to our presenters, and thank you, Steven, especially for that one here. So I wish you all a very good day. Je vous souhaite tous une très bonne journée et au plaisir de vous revoir une prochaine fois.